She wasn't identified by her face or her fingerprints. She was identified by a small metal bracelet bearing two readable words: Dark Angel. 19-year-old Pam Pitts vanished from a forest clearing outside Prescott, Arizona in 1988. 13 days later, investigators made a devastating discovery in those same woods. This is Crime Narrator. This is the case of the Dark Angel of Prescott. Pamela Pitts went by Pam. She was born on June 25, 1969, at K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base in Forsyth Township, Michigan, while her father Paul was still serving in the military. When Paul left the service, the family settled in Prescott, a small mountain town in central Arizona known for its pine forests, its granite outcrops, and its claim to hosting the world's oldest rodeo. Pam grew up there, the oldest of 4 children, and by every account she carried herself like it. Outgoing, a little protective, the kind of person who made friends easily and kept them. She had one hobby that defined her among her friends. In the 1980s, before cell phones, teenagers in towns like Prescott talked to each other over CB radio, and every user picked a handle. Pam picked Dark Angel. It would matter later. It would matter more than anyone could have predicted. At 19, Pam was working as a bookkeeper for McCabe's Sandwiches in nearby Prescott Valley, a job she genuinely liked. She was also doing what a lot of 19-year-olds do, testing what independence actually felt like. In June of 1988, she moved out of her parents' house and into a small home on Lincoln Street with her best friend, a young woman named Shelley Norgard. Money was tight almost immediately. To help cover the rent, the two women brought in a third roommate, a young man named Jeremy Anderson. For a few months, by most accounts, the three of them got along fine. But independence, it turned out, came with a bill Pam wasn't sure she could keep paying. On the evening of September 14, 1988, Pam had dinner with her father at Murphy's restaurant in Prescott. She told him the truth. Rent was hard, money was tight, she was tired. She asked if it would be okay to move back home. Paul told her, of course. They agreed she'd come by that Saturday to start moving her things and do a load of laundry. He didn't know it yet, but that dinner was the last time he would ever see his daughter alive. Saturday, September 17th, came and went. Pam never showed up. Sunday passed the same way. It was Monday morning that changed everything. Paul called Pam's workplace, half expecting a simple explanation. Her boss told him she hadn't shown up for her shift. She hadn't called in either. For a young woman who was, by every account, dependable almost to a fault, that silence was its own kind of alarm. Paul went to the police. Sergeant Bill Hobbs responded to the house on Lincoln Street. Shelley Norgard answered the door. Inside, officers found Pam's purse, her driver's license, her medication, all still sitting exactly where she would have left them if she'd only stepped out for an evening. Her car was parked outside, untouched. Shelley told officers Pam had gone out to party and she hadn't worried much about it. Pam did that sometimes. She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that the two of them shared a joint checking account for rent, and that Pam had emptied it without paying her share. She said she was a little upset about that. Nobody in that kitchen could have known how much weight that detail would eventually carry. For nearly 2 weeks, Prescott held its breath the way small towns do. Then, on September 29, 1988, 13 days after anyone had last seen her, 2 people passing through Gordo's pit noticed something on top of a pile of garbage bags at the edge of the clearing. It was Pam. Physical evidence at the scene made visual identification impossible. One responding officer documented the scene plainly. Evidence found near a pile of garbage bags where a fire had cleared the surrounding area. Another investigator, looking back on it years later, said the sheer brutality of what had happened to her was the single most striking thing about that scene. More than the isolation of the clearing, more than the fire itself. Dental records confirmed what the bracelet had already suggested. The medical examiner faced an impossible task. The fire had destroyed too much to establish a precise cause of death. What forensic evidence could establish was that Pam had not lost her life at that location. Investigators determined her life was taken elsewhere, and she was brought to the clearing only after a delay. The official finding was simply this: homicidal violence. Separately, during the search of the Lincoln Street house, an officer made a strange discovery: a photograph of Pam, hidden inside the wood stove. No one has ever explained why it was there. Keep that detail in your pocket. It's going to matter again, later, in a way that never gets resolved. News of the killing moved through Prescott fast. A tourist town built on a reputation for small-town safety suddenly had a burned body in a popular party spot and no explanation for it. Parents started asking their kids where they'd really been that weekend. For a while, nobody in town quite trusted the woods the way they used to. Investigators from both the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office and the Prescott Police Department worked the case together, and in 1988, they were working with what 1988 actually offered: no national DNA database, no genetic genealogy. What they had was a burned scene, a handful of physical items that survived the fire, and whatever people were willing to tell them. That limitation would define this case for the next 3 decades. Detectives began with the people closest to Pam. Her roommate, Jeremy Anderson, said he'd been at a football game that night, then out with friends. His account held up. He was cleared. Shelley Norgard said she'd gotten off work, picked up her boyfriend, Raymond Clare, and gone with him to a friend's house until the early morning hours. Raymond confirmed it and passed a polygraph. For the moment, Shelley's story held together. Then the town filled in the blanks on its own. A rumor spread that a local individual had allegedly claimed responsibility in connection with an extremist group. Investigators tracked him down. He denied it, and nothing about Pam's remains supported the claim. It went nowhere. Other names floated through town that fall too: a drug dealer, an old boyfriend, a local cowboy. None of it ever substantiated. And there was Melinda Perry, a young woman with a reputation for a temper, who witnesses said had fought with Pam that night. Melinda denied being at the party at all and offered an alibi. She said she'd spent the night at a motel with a local band. Investigators tried to confirm it and couldn't, while more witnesses kept insisting she'd been at Gordo's Pit. The Yavapai County attorney eventually convened an investigative grand jury and put her under oath. She held her story under questioning, insisting she'd had nothing to do with what happened to Pam. The grand jury didn't believe her, and in December of 1989 she was sentenced to 41 days in jail. Not for murder, but for contempt of court tied to a perjury indictment. The perjury charges themselves were dropped the following year. She left the state and never came back to the spotlight this case had put on her. None of it led anywhere. Not the rumors. Not Melinda Perry. Not even the roommate who had emptied a joint bank account and who friends said had been overheard, in the days around Pam's disappearance, saying she'd kill Pam if she found her. Comments police at the time treated as something an angry person says and doesn't mean. Over those same years, Shelley's own account of that night kept shifting. At different points, she said she'd never even been at Gordo's Pit. At other points, she suggested a different roommate might have been responsible. More than once, she said it flatly. "I never killed my roommate. I never wanted to kill anyone. I loved her dearly." A story that changes every time it's told isn't proof of anything on its own. But investigators noticed. They kept noticing, for 32 years, that the story never once stayed the same twice. The case went cold. And the break, when it finally came, wouldn't come from a lab or a lucky witness. It would come from an entirely separate murder. Nearly 3 years after Pam vanished on May 25, 1991, a group of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University students exploring an old mine off Iron Springs Road found a body in a vertical shaft. It was a man, wrapped in thick lining, who had suffered a fatal gunshot wound. He was identified as Raymond Clare, 24 years old, an aspiring pilot who had recently earned his flight license. Shelley Norgard's boyfriend, the same Raymond Clare who had given Shelley her alibi 3 years earlier. In the weeks before his body was found, Raymond's family had already been growing uneasy. He'd told them he was heading to California to find flight instructor work and build hours toward a career in commercial aviation. Then, abruptly, he came back to Arizona to collect his things, and, after that, nothing. His family called Shelley repeatedly, and her answers kept moving. First that he was simply busy, later that he'd found work out of the country and couldn't be reached. When Raymond failed to show up for a family wedding, his relatives stopped accepting vague answers and went to police themselves. Investigators traced backward from the mine. Tire tracks near the shaft matched a pickup Shelley had recently borrowed from a friend. When detectives searched her home, they found forensic evidence leading toward the garage. They followed the trail to her car, where investigators immediately detected signs of severe decomposition inside the trunk. Inside, significant physical evidence was recovered, later confirmed to match Raymond's blood type, and under the front seat, a 9mm handgun. Ballistics matched it to the murder weapon. A flashlight recovered near the body in the mine carried a single fingerprint. It belonged to Shelley. On June 4, 1991, Shelley Norgard was arrested. She told Raymond's worried family the same kind of story she'd told police about Pam 3 years earlier, that he'd simply gone out of town for work and was too busy to call, deny, deflect, wait for the questions to stop. This time, the physical evidence didn't let the questions stop. For nearly 2 years, she held to her denial. Then, in June of 1993, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Her account: Raymond had wanted to end the relationship and take their dogs to California without her. She said the confrontation happened while the two of them were lying on the roof of a car, watching planes pass overhead, and that she shot him there. Investigators didn't fully believe that part. Blood evidence at the apartment suggested the shooting actually happened inside their home. What they believed was that Raymond's body sat in the trunk of her car for roughly 2 weeks before she borrowed a 4-wheel drive truck and drove him up the mountain to the mine shaft. They suspected she'd had help moving him. No one else was ever charged. Shelley Norgard was sentenced to 20 years, no parole. Investigators saw the pattern immediately. A young woman, dead, her body hidden and then dumped outside the city limits, her death following her decision to leave. Now, a young man, dead, his body hidden and then dumped outside the city limits, his death following his decision to leave. 2 people in her life said they were going, and both of them ended up dead. Nobody in Yavapai County was in a position to say that out loud in a courtroom yet. There was no physical evidence connecting Shelley to Pam's death. Nothing recovered from Gordo's pit. Nothing from the Lincoln Street house. Police offered immunity to anyone who'd helped move or burn Pam's body, if they'd just come forward. Nobody ever did. The case went cold again for the second time, and it would stay that way for another 20 years. In that time, Paul Pitts kept living in a town small enough that he almost certainly crossed paths more than once with people who quietly suspected exactly who had killed his daughter. At the grocery store, on the street, at gatherings where nobody said her name out loud. That is the part of an unsolved case that never makes it into a headline. Not just the absence of an answer, but 2 decades of ordinary proximity to a silence nobody could force open. In May of 2011, Shelley Norgard completed her sentence and walked free. She moved to Nevada, settled near Carson City, remarried and became Shelley Harmon. Bookkeeping, tax work, managing rental properties, a life that looked from the outside like nothing at all. She never registered as a convicted felon in her new home state, the way the law required. It would be years before anyone there learned why that mattered. But in Yavapai County, a detective named Victor Dart had just picked up Pam's file. He read through decades of old interviews. He looked at the pattern nobody had ever been able to prove. Before Shelley's release in February of 2011, he interviewed her in prison about Pam's murder. She denied it, as she always had. When he pressed her directly, she grew upset and began to cry. and the interview was cut short. Not a confession, but not nothing. For 6 years, Dart kept working the file. The witnesses who remembered Shelley driving around Prescott that night saying she'd kill Pam if she found her. The ones who remembered her talking, before Pam ever died, about how to make a body disappear, whether that meant fire or a mine shaft. When police had put those comments to her directly, years before, she'd admitted saying something like it, but insisted she was only talking theoretically. A search of the home she'd once shared with Pam turned up nothing that could prove otherwise. Promising didn't file charges, though. Every path Dart chased led back to the same person, and every dead end only confirmed what he already believed. He needed something that didn't depend on anyone's 30-year-old memory. He needed something in Shelley's own voice. In nearly every American prison, phone calls are recorded as a matter of routine. Somewhere in that archive was a call between Shelley and her father, not long after she'd been questioned again about Pam. Her father tells her he's worried that the moment she walks free, she'll be arrested. He tells her he's always wondered what really happened that night because she never told him. And Shelley answers him. "I had a moment," she says. "I had a huge moment." Then the line goes quiet. To Dart, it was the moment everything changed. Not a confession in so many words, but an admission that something had happened, something she'd never once been willing to name, not even to her own father. It was enough to take to the county attorney and ask for an indictment. On June 4, 2017, 50-year-old Shelley Harmon was arrested outside Carson City, Nevada, and charged with the first-degree murder of Pamela Pitts. She still hadn't registered as a felon under Nevada law, which meant local authorities had to be told what she'd actually done before they even understood who they'd taken into custody. She was extradited to Arizona and held on a $3 million bond. Every case on this channel means weeks of digging through real records for real families. If this one has you leaning in, hit like and subscribe. It's what keeps cases like Pam's from staying forgotten. Now, back to the courtroom, because this case is about to take one more turn nobody was expecting. What followed was not the swift reckoning her family had waited 3 decades for. Shelley's defense argued that her 20-year sentence for killing Raymond should never be mentioned to a jury, that it would unfairly prejudice a case that, on its own, had no physical evidence at all. The judge agreed. A jury would never be told that the woman on trial for Pam's murder had already been convicted of killing someone else under strikingly similar circumstances. For prosecutors, it was close to fatal. Witnesses from 1988 had died or forgotten. Records that should have still existed were incomplete after 3 decades in storage. The medical examiner had never established a specific cause of death, which meant a defense attorney could argue almost anything. Shelley's own attorney, Dwayne Cates, said publicly that the evidence pointed towards someone else entirely, and that the case had been needlessly dragged out for years. Prosecutor Dennis McGrain later admitted the choice weighed heavily: risk everything at trial, or find another way to get an answer on the record. "It weighed heavily on us," he said afterward, guaranteeing an outcome versus taking a chance at trial. They found another way. With the difficult, painful consent of Pam's family, prosecutors offered Shelley a deal: plead guilty to second-degree murder, describe what happened, and walk free on time already served. The 20 years for Raymond, plus the years already spent in county jail awaiting this trial. It was not justice in any traditional sense. It was a trade. Pam's family made it anyway, because after 32 years, they had decided that knowing mattered more than punishing. On March 1, 2021, Shelley Harmon stood in a Yavapai County courtroom and told the truth for the first time in her adult life. Pam's family filled the gallery behind the prosecution table. Her father, her siblings, nieces, and nephews who had grown up only ever hearing about the aunt they never got to meet. She said she'd been upset about the overdrawn account, upset that Pam was moving out and leaving her to cover rent alone. She admitted to a physical confrontation, stating that Pam fell during the argument and ceased breathing, causing her to panic and flee the scene. What she never explained, what the plea deal never required her to explain, was everything after that moment. How Pam's body came to be hidden for days, maybe weeks, how it came to be carried to a pile of trash at Gordo's pit and set on fire. Prosecutors weren't permitted to ask. Shelley Harmon walked out of that courtroom having admitted to a killing, while the desecration of her victim's body stayed, officially, a mystery. Pam's sister, Carrie Tarver, said afterward she didn't believe it was the whole truth, that Shelley's story stopped exactly where the hardest details would have started. Investigators had long suspected she'd had help, both with Raymond's body and possibly with Pam's. No one else was ever charged in either case. Shelley Harmon walked free the same day she confessed, taking the identity of whoever might have helped her at the crime scene to her grave. And that detail from the Lincoln Street wood stove, the photograph of Pam, hidden where no one could explain it, never got answered either. It's still just sitting there in an old case file, a small locked door nobody ever found the key to. For Pam's father, Paul, the day brought something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite peace, a confession, and nothing resembling the punishment he believed the crime deserved. Some people in Nevada who knew Shelley Harmon as a bookkeeper, a neighbor, a wife, didn't believe she was capable of what she'd just described in open court. A friend of hers there, a woman named Mary Burgoon, said publicly that she'd shared meals with Shelley and her husband, that she believed Shelley was unjustly jailed, and that she'd only pleaded guilty to avoid going back to prison. "Wouldn't you," Burgoon said, "if that was the only way you could get out of there?" It's a strange footnote to a case that ended in a signed confession, proof that even a guilty plea spoken aloud in open court doesn't end every disagreement about what actually happened. Paul Pitts put it more simply than anyone. Shelley Harmon, he said, was now a 2-time convicted killer. His advice to her husband: sleep with one eye open. There was no press conference announcing new laws, no institutional reckoning for the 3 decades it took to get this far. What changed was smaller and more human. A family that had lived 32 years without an answer finally had one, even an incomplete one, even one wrapped in a deal that let her walk free the same afternoon she confessed. Closed and solved were never quite the same thing here. She was 19. She talked for hours on a CB radio under a name that ended up being the only word investigators could read off her body. She had just worked up the honesty, at 19, to admit she wasn't ready for the independent life she'd chased, and she was already planning her way back home. She should be in her 50s now. She should have had the decades nobody gave her a chance to have. A career built past bookkeeping, a family of her own, birthdays that kept adding up instead of stopping cold on a Friday night in September. 2 men in Shelley's life told her they were leaving. 2 of them ended up dead. It took a burned bracelet, a mine shaft, a fingerprint on a flashlight, and one unguarded sentence into a prison telephone to finally say that out loud in a courtroom. It never fully explained who else might have known. It never explained the photograph in the stove. Some cases end with a name. This one ends with a name and a list of things that name will never have to answer for. If there's a lesson here, it isn't about strangers in vans or unlocked doors. It's about how long silence can be maintained by someone who looks completely ordinary. A roommate, a friend, someone who sits across a kitchen table from a grieving father and says she isn't too worried. Trust your instincts about the people closest to you, even when everyone else tells you there's nothing to worry about. Pam trusted her roommate enough to live with her, to argue with her over rent the way roommates do, and never once imagined that argument could be the last one of her life. If this case stayed with you, hit like, subscribe, and tell us which moment landed hardest. We'll see you in the next one, because no case stays cold forever.